Welcome to the South Bay Diabetes Rewind Seminar. We hope you enjoy today's presentation. We have many other health presentations on our YouTube channel. Feel free to check them out.
All right, well, we'd like to welcome everybody to our Diabetes Rewind Session 2. I'm glad everybody's back, and if there's anybody joining us for the first time, we're glad you're here, and we hope you enjoy it. And our first session is on the website, so if you weren't with us, you can look and see and get those wonderful recipes that you're going to get another one from Miss Rachel. Of course, as I said, this is our second session. We will be doing this for 6 weeks, every Thursday at 7 o'clock until all the way up through July 15th. I just want everybody to remember, please sign in using your full name. And if you don't mind, turn your screen on, because I saw some blank spaces where I should have saw some pretty smiling faces. So we can get to learn names and faces and faces and names. So please do that. And if you don't know how to name yourselves, down in the participant box, there is a section that will help you that you can click on to rename, and you'll be able to do that. And also, if you have any friends that you like to tell about this program, just send them to the website, www.southbaysca.org/health. All righty. We also want to remind everybody, if you have not done that consent with your doctor, please do so. It's on the website also. And for those of you who did it, we thank you, and we hope that you have a wonderful time. And if you need help doing that, please let your group leaders know. That is why they are here. They're here to help you through this whole process. And we encourage you to check out the website for additional resources, the different handouts, recipes for each of the sessions. And you can print out as many as you want and pass them out to all your friends and family if you like to, or just direct them to the website. And you also find the homework. Yes, y'all had homework. I hope you did it. We'll find out a little later. You'll find it there that you can print out if you missed last week's session. Well, this week, we're going to start off with that wonderful Rachel Duckwaller for another good recipe. So, Miss Rachel, you can take it away, please.
I am joining you again from very far away in the horrible heat of Missouri. It's really misery today. It's 97 degrees right now. It got up to 102. I was like, man, go on vacation to get away from the heat. And I walk right into it again. So anyway, today I'm sharing a recipe with you that is from cauliflower. I'm going to tell you a little bit about cauliflower, because cauliflower is just an amazing vegetable that you can use. It's really high in vitamins, it's really high in minerals, and it's really low on the glycemic index and in calories. There's only 25 calories in 1 cup of cauliflower, so you don't have to feel guilty about eating it at all. And it's amazingly versatile. I remember growing up, most of the way that we ate cauliflower was with ranch, while it was raw, or boiled and added with cheese, and that was it, just a cheese sauce on top of it. But there's so many other ways that you can prepare it. There are also many other options available to us now for how you can get it prepared. I know that not everyone loves cutting up vegetables as much as I do, so you can also go into your freezer section or the produce section of your local supermarket, and you can find it in many different ways. They have rice cauliflower, they have cauliflower florets, and you can keep that in your freezer or in your refrigerator. It will stay very good for quite a while. The other thing that's nice about cauliflower is it has a really neutral flavor, so we can make it taste like whatever we want it to taste like. And we're going to have a little bit of fun with that. So and assuming you don't have time, please do grab it and keep it in your freezer and keep it in your refrigerator at all times. There's just so many things you can do with it. And I'm going to just give you one today. So to start off with, I have a frozen bag of riced cauliflower. Now, a lot of people like to use this just as rice and use it stir-fried, and you can do that. In this recipe, I just had it so it was something that is very simple and easy, and it doesn't take very long to cook. I'm going to blend it anyway because this is going to be a cauliflower sauce, an Alfredo sauce. And this, when I started to, I put it in a pan, and you can see how small the pieces are, and added some water and boiled it. And that's honestly all I did. Takes about 10 minutes. And back in the recipe, you can see that I have a whole head of garlic there. And I'm going to be honest with you, I did not use that head of garlic. I totally cheated and used garlic powder because I didn't really have the time to saute garlic and get it the way I like it. And garlic powder does the trick, and it works really well in this recipe. So don't be afraid to substitute garlic powder in this recipe. And again, there's very few ingredients, as you see, that are going into this, but it has a whole lot of flavor. So after we boil the cauliflower, we throw everything into a blender. And as you can see, I had the nutritional yeast. I put the cashews at the very bottom because nuts take a little bit more to blend up. And then the cauliflower on top. You don't even need to add any liquid to this because the cauliflower has enough liquid on its own. And so you blend it until the sauce is smooth. And then you already have a sauce that's already made. You don't have to reheat it or anything. It's ready to go. Now I serve this on pasta with a side of steamed kale. Now there are many, many options that you can find for pastas now. And I know if you're like me and you love white pasta, there's so many other things that are out there. And I've actually found that I like other choices better now. There's red lentil pasta and there's chickpea pasta. And those are some of my favorites. You can find brown rice and quinoa. You can find just about any other kind. And I challenge you, if you haven't given some of those a try, you definitely should. So, and of course, they're higher in nutrients. And there's all different types of textures and flavors when you change. And I challenge you to see if you can find one that you love too. So this recipe, as you can see, is very easy. I hope you'll give it a shot. It's, again, low in calories and absolutely delicious. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions for me, I can take those now.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yes, thank you.
Right. Well, we're going to move right along. We're going to get into our first medical lecture with Dr. Inankur. Doctor, it's over to you.
Great, thank you, Kendra. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Right, good evening. Well, it's great to be back with you today. This evening, we're going to talk about fats in 3 locations: in our blood, in our cells, and in the food we eat. And we'll see how fats in these 3 different contexts affect our diabetes risk. And before we begin, though, I just want to say this week, again, as I said last week, that this program is for educational purposes. Because the information provided in Diabetes Rewind is effective, we would like you to implement it with the support and guidance of your healthcare provider. So before adopting any of the principles we discuss, please talk with your healthcare provider. And do monitor your blood sugars just as often as your healthcare provider has advised you to monitor them. And in addition, I recommend checking your blood sugars if you feel like your blood sugars are low, if you feel like they're high. Work closely with your healthcare provider to prevent life-threatening hypoglycemia and to make sure that your medications are reduced as your medication needs are changing. I'd like to tell you about Mr. A's story. Mr. A is not his real name, but I met this gentleman last month. He was 63 years old at the time, and he told me he'd been diagnosed with prediabetes 30 years prior. Now, he's had prediabetes for a long time without advancing into type 2 diabetes. He had actually been to the clinic where I work 3 years ago, and at that time, his fasting blood glucose was 99, so it was at the very top of the normal range. His A1C was 6.4, and you'll recall that normal A1Cs go up to 5.6. The diabetes range starts at 6.5, so he was at the top of the prediabetes range based on his A1C. And at that time, his weight was 269. Now, he'd had his A1C check last fall, and it was still 6.4 in the prediabetes range. Last month, when he came to clinic, he had gained a little weight since his prior visit. He retired in the past year. He'd been more sedentary and been eating a little more. His total cholesterol was elevated above 200, and his LDL cholesterol was also elevated at 157. The optimal range for LDL is less than 100. At the time that his labs were done, he had been eating meat 3 to 4 times a week. He had been consuming dairy, again, 3 to 4 times a week, and had been eating eggs on a weekly basis. He decided to do a lifestyle change program. And so he switched on the 17th of May to a plant-based whole foods diet. So he was eating only plants, and he started intermittent fasting. He was eating breakfast and lunch and skipping suppers. So he had a long overnight fast. 8 days later, his weight had dropped, actually 13 pounds. His fasting blood glucose was well within the normal range at 78. His total cholesterol was also normal, being less than 200. His LDL cholesterol was still elevated, but it had fallen 39 points in just 8 days. He told me he was forcing himself to eat breakfast. He was eating lots of fruit, which he had not previously been eating. He felt satisfied after his meals, had no hunger, and was very happy with the results. Now, Mr. A basically cut out the high-fat animal products from his diet. He switched to a lower fat plant-based diet, and his blood sugars and weight fell as a result. Now, this is more of a weight loss than I recommend in 8 days. The typical recommendation is to lose 1 to 2 pounds a week during a lifestyle change. Some people, though, will lose a little more initially as they're losing fluid weight. The link between fat intake and insulin resistance has been known for quite a while. Back in the 1920s, Dr. Shirley Sweeney tested 7 diets on medical students, and he found that the higher the fat content, the higher the insulin resistance, the lower the fat content and higher the carb content, the lower the insulin resistance. More recently, Dr. So-Jung Lee infused fat into research participants overnight, and he found that as fat levels in the blood went up, so did insulin resistance. And then as fat levels in the blood came down after the infusion, so did insulin resistance. Now, persons with type 1 diabetes often wear insulin pumps to calculate their insulin needs. And in a small study of 7 individuals with type 1 diabetes, the blood sugars and insulin needs were monitored after a high-fat meal versus a low-fat meal. So these persons with type 1 diabetes were wearing insulin pumps, which were calculating how much insulin they needed based on their blood sugars after the meal. They got 60 grams of fat for the high-fat dinner and then 10 grams of fat for the low-fat dinner, and both dinners had the same amounts of carbohydrate and protein. They found that after the high-fat dinner, individuals needed more insulin, 3.6 units more than they did at the time of the low-fat dinner. So because these 2 diets had identical amount of carbohydrates, it was clear that the higher fat content in the dinner caused insulin resistance, requiring more insulin to deal with that same amount of carbohydrate. This is a picture of competition between fat and glucose in a human muscle cell. The muscle cell can either burn glucose or it can burn fat as energy. So insulin comes along, it binds to the insulin receptor, which causes a transport protein to move to the wall of the cell, and glucose can then enter the cell. Glucose can then be broken down into products and burned as energy in the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria. Fatty acids can also enter the cell through their transport protein. As you may recall from last week, fatty acids can enter the cell, though, without the action of insulin. Fatty acids can then be broken down into different substances, and ultimately, fatty acids may be used as energy in the mitochondria. The breakdown products can be used as energy. So basically, the muscle cells have the ability to either use fatty acids or glucose as energy, but if they're using fatty acids, that process blocks the use of glucose as energy. So there is a competition between fatty acids and glucose as energy sources in the muscle cell. Now, glucose disposal is the transport of glucose out of the blood and into our cells. We want glucose to be disposed of so it can be used as energy in our cells. And here we see as fatty acid levels rise in the blood in a physiologic range. So this is a range that fatty acids may rise in a typical individual. As they rise, glucose disposal or glucose entry into the cells decreases, and it can decrease up to 46%. So it's not just fat in the blood, though, that can make a difference in our diabetes risk and can cause our blood sugars to rise. Actually, fat in the tissues of our bodies has an impact. A study looking at a large group of individuals between 1976 and 1990 looked at their risk of developing diabetes over that time period. And this study correlated risk of developing diabetes with body mass index. And body mass index is a measure of the appropriateness of a person's weight or their height. So a normal body mass index is 18.5 to 24.9. And you can see that when people in this study had a normal weight for their height, their risk of developing type 2 diabetes was relatively low. It was well under 10%. As body mass indexes went into the overweight category depicted here in blue, risk of developing type 2 diabetes increased in both men and women. And as body mass indexes went into the obese category, risk of developing type 2 diabetes went up more. This kind of information led Dr. Roy Taylor to come up with the twin cycle hypothesis. Dr. Taylor is a researcher in England at Newcastle University, and he hypothesized that as a person gained fat in their liver, some of that fat could be transported to the pancreas. And once in the pancreas, fat could decrease the function of the beta cells of the pancreas. And those beta cells normally make insulin. So as fat increased in the beta cells of the pancreas, insulin production would decline. He also thought that if a person started to lose weight and their fat went down in the liver, there would be less fat transported to the pancreas, and consequently less fat in the pancreas. And ultimately, the insulin-producing beta cells could start to function better. Dr. Taylor has done studies looking at hundreds of individuals with type 2 diabetes. He puts them onto a lifestyle change program to induce some weight loss, and then he takes pictures of the pancreases and livers of these individuals. Here's a picture of someone who had type 2 diabetes at the start of a study. And here is what their liver looked like. The liver had a high fat content, 36% fat. This put them in the fatty liver disease category. They were on a calorie-restricted diet, a very low-calorie diet of 600 calories a day for 8 weeks. And at the end of that 8 weeks, their liver contained only 2% fat. So this was a normal amount of fat. This individual no longer had fatty liver disease, and their diabetes had reversed. Now, it's not just the liver that's affected by increased fat. As I mentioned, the pancreas is also affected. And Dr. Taylor found that in his patients or research study participants with type 2 diabetes, pancreas volume was 25% less than in persons that he was studying who didn't have diabetes. Here you can see a cross-section of the abdomen. You can see the pancreas in the middle of the abdomen depicted in yellow. And in an individual with diabetes, the pancreas is smaller. It has some holes in it, kind of looks like a sponge. And here's another picture of the normal pancreas and a picture of a pancreas, someone with diabetes. There are yellow dots, more yellow dots in the pancreas that's affected by diabetes, and those dots represent increased fat. So the question was, does the pancreas return to normal size with diabetes remission? Well, Dr. Taylor took a picture of multiple individuals as they were starting his studies. And this is what the pancreas looked like, again, like a sponge with holes. At 5 months into the program, so this was after they had lost weight, they were on a low-calorie diet for a couple of months, they reintroduced regular food into their diet, but they were able to maintain the weight loss. At 5 months into this program, their pancreas was starting to look more solid. At 12 months, the pancreas was looking even more full. And at 24 months after the weight loss, the pancreas looked nearly identical to that of someone who had never had diabetes. So at 2 years after weight loss, or after the start of weight loss program, if a person kept at least 10 kilograms or 22 pounds off, 64% were in remission. So losing 22 pounds, keeping that off for 2 years, led to about 2/3 of people being in remission from diabetes. So it's clear that a higher body mass index increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, but not everyone who is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes is overweight. A study in England looking at persons diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in the late 1970s to the early 1990s showed that 36% of these persons had body mass indexes less than 25. So these people were not overweight or obese when they were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And this has led to the idea of a personal fat threshold. You can see in the bottom figure here, some individuals may develop diabetes if they gain weight and they cross a BMI of about 22. So their personal fat threshold would be 22. Another individual may need to reach a BMI of about 29 before they develop type 2 diabetes. And for someone else here on the bottom right, diabetes may develop when the BMI crosses about 37. But the good news is that if a person with type 2 diabetes loses weight and goes back below their personal fat threshold, they can also go into diabetes remission. So in summary, fat competes with glucose as an energy source in our cells, our muscle cells, and in other cells. And this is a reason that blood glucose rises after a high-fat meal. Excess body weight does increase our risk of developing type 2 diabetes, but type 2 diabetes doesn't just develop if a person is overweight. It can develop when we cross our personal fat threshold. Thankfully, this process is reversible. In our next session, we're going to look at fats in our diet, the good fats and the bad fats. I look forward to discussing this with you right after the break.
Well, it's good to see you all this evening. Last week, we talked about habits and how important they are. And we particularly looked at Jesus and how Jesus had habits in his life that directed who he was. If we could just find ways of shaping our habits so that we became a different person, the way we acted, the way we thought, the way we ate, we just had a completely different lifestyle. Sometimes when we consider changes in our life, we think of it as a temporary thing, just a short period that once this gets corrected, then I'll go back to the way things were before. But in all honesty, we know that there is a healthy way of living that would benefit us if we did. I was taking a class from a friend of mine. She's a nutritionist, and she was talking about green leafy salads and how beneficial they are for us. To be honest with you, I don't like salad. I've never liked salad, and I just don't enjoy it. But I became convicted that I needed that nutrition in my body, and I was going to have to find some way in order to start eating salad. I tell you, I found there is a secret in the Bible that I want to share with you this evening that can help take habits that we'd like to have and make them actually a part of our life. There is a story that's told in the book of Daniel. Daniel is a very old book in the Bible. It was written around 600 BC, so it's a long time ago. And Daniel was an Israelite, a Jew that had been captured in his land and taken to Babylon, and he was a captive in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, and then eventually Babylon fell to Medo-Persia, and he was a captive now in the court of Darius. He was placed in a very high position because he was a very smart individual, and while there were those that did not like him, and they wanted him put out. And they began to try to come up with ways to remove him from his position and, in fact, have him killed. When we face difficulties in life, when we face challenges in life, sometimes it can seem overwhelming. But when we look at the experience of others, we think to ourselves, well, at least it's not that bad. When I think about Daniel's experience compared to my own, I think his experience is far worse than what I've experienced. I haven't been a captive. I haven't been made a slave in another land. I haven't been taken away from my family. I haven't been forced to work in another place. I mean, it seems pretty bad. But I have experienced people not liking me and people wanting me to get out of their life. I have experienced difficulty, and I'm sure you have experienced difficulty as well. He was experiencing difficulty, but there was something in his life he found that gave him strength to go through all of the challenges he faced. And this, there's a verse here in Daniel chapter 6 and verse 10. The men that were against him had eventually connived with the king, and they had the king sign a document that was going to, in essence, cause him to be put to death. And so the Bible says this. Now, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he entered his house. He went up to his roof chamber that had windows open, and he knelt down upon his knees 3 times a day, just as he had before. So Daniel had a habit. He would kneel down 3 times a day, and he would seek God for help and strength. This is the secret to habits. Regardless of how we feel, regardless of the circumstances we face, there is a God that is there present to help. And so Daniel found that when he sought God regularly, that God was there for him. In fact, his relationship with God was a part of who he was. And regardless of what others tried to do to circumvent his own experience, his own life, his own job, he found that his connection with God was worth more than the rest of all of that. And so he found that in a consistent life of prayer, there was strength to develop and habits that would keep his life moving the direction he wanted. And so this is the key to successful change of habits in your life and my life. When we seek God for strength, he's there. God is real. He's a living God. And I have found him to be a help for me. Now, it may sound somewhat silly to you, but for me, it's pretty significant. I didn't like salad, but every day I asked God for strength. Lord, help me to appreciate salad. And you know what? My taste buds have changed. I appreciate salad now. And I have a nice, healthy salad every day. In fact, you can see my wife and I make this exact salad that I eat every day on our YouTube channel, South Bay's YouTube channel. They're under healthy preparing meals or cooking meals or something. You'll see how we make our salad. That's the salad that I eat every single day. Very nutritious. But the only way that I can make a change in my life is through the power that God can give. So I want to encourage you as you go through this program and you're learning different principles that really, down in your heart, you know, this is really healthy. This is what I should be doing, is try to implement those in your life and ask God regularly, daily, 3 times a day, at every single meal. God, help me to change my taste buds. Help me to eat differently. Whatever it is I need to do differently, help me. And God will be there and he will help you. And I will be praying for you that God will continue to give you the strength that you need every day. So God bless you. And I'll turn the time back over to Kendra.
Thank you, Pastor Chris. I love salad. I eat it every day, but I guess I'll be praying to the Lord to help us with, well, especially me, with our next part, the exercising feature, because I hate exercising. So Laura, we're going to take it over to you, and hopefully you'll give us some interesting things that will help people like me get up and move.
You exactly struck on what I was going to say, and that is food may not be your issue, but exercise may be. This is not a comfortable thing to do. It takes many of us outside of our comfort zone. So I wanted to check in with you before I share my screen and see, has anyone tried the principles that we laid out last week? I'll be honest and say I restarted a good exercise program this week. I have some friends that have been meeting me to help encourage me along the way. Good job, Kiana. So if you are having trouble doing your exercise, then I would highly recommend find some friends that can help hold you accountable, because it makes all the difference in the world. I am not staring at the clock anymore while I exercise. I am able to enjoy it and have a lot of fun with my friends talking as we are working on exercise. And yes, we get to the point where we can't say full sentences. That's kind of the point of the talking. So we're going to go back and talk about the principles that we talked about last week, and then focus on a little bit more this week. So we talked about burst training last week, and if I can make my screens, there it goes. Okay. And our goal of burst training was to perform aerobic exercise, right? So while I'm talking to you, I'm going to get up and be stepping. I would appreciate your getting up and doing some sort of movement as well. The goal is to be performing aerobic exercise, which is the same thing as cardiovascular exercise. It is moving for our heart's sake. We will know that we are doing it correctly when we are starting to get out of breath, when our heart rate is increasing, when we are unable to talk in full sentences anymore, and when it's getting just uncomfortable. It's not comfortable to get to the point of a good strenuous cardiovascular exercise. Okay, so we are going to talk about changing a variable this week. We need to work on continuing our training. And so to continue our training, we need to change a variable. To do this, I'm going to suggest that this week you increase the length of your bursts. So last week we talked about starting with 20 to 30 seconds for our bursts, okay? If you started with 20 seconds last week, you're going to increase by 2 to 5 seconds this week, each burst that you do, okay? So now your burst, if you started with 30 seconds and you need a little more challenge, might be between that 22 seconds and 35 seconds. I set a timer on my phone, and I start as soon as I pound the pavement with my heavy steps, and then I will stop my burst when I hear that timer ring, and I know that then I can have some relief. Now, what if you say to me, but it's all I can do to get that 20 seconds in? Good. That's enough exercise for you right now to get that good cardiovascular exercise. So keep at it this week, but realize that as you are doing this exercise, it will become easy for you. So if that landmark has not become easy this week, keep at what you're doing. But next week, try again to increase your burst, because it will become easy for you. Okay, but our goal is to increase your heart rate. Okay, once you have completed that burst, we need to remember to slow down safely. So do a nice cool down lap until you are able to breathe and talk at your normal pace. Remember that sometimes there will be different variables going on. Sometimes when I'm doing my cardio, I sound like a dog panting while I'm breathing. I'm really gasping for air. Remember, we are aiming for the section that is yellow to orange here, where you are going somewhere between hard and really hard as far as the effort that you are exerting and how hard you are breathing, okay? If you are gasping for air, realize that your intensity may be too strong for the conditions. Maybe it's too hot outside for you to be exercising this hard. Maybe you haven't been drinking the water that your body needs to put forth this amount of exercise. Maybe your body's trying to fight a bug, or maybe you have allergies. My daughter and I were just in the allergist's office, so this is high on my thoughts right now. But whatever the case is, you need to resolve those issues before you are returning to activity. Finally, to recover, I want to teach you a little something about breathing. We call it pursed lip breathing. So I like to think of it as birthday candle breathing. You breathe through your nose really deeply while you are recovering. This is not while you're exercising. Breathe normal while you're exercising. Pant, do what you have to do. But when you are recovering, you're going to think of it as you're trying to smell a rose garden. I go up and down my street and there are many neighbors that have roses planted in mailboxes. And so I will literally think of myself as enjoying a big sniff of the roses through my nose. And then I will put my mouth together and I will blow out of my mouth like I'm blowing out birthday candles. Okay, that is pursed lip breathing. It will help you recover from exercise faster. It will help your heart and body get the oxygen that it needs. And so this little graphic about birthday candle breathing maybe will help you like it does me. Again, a deep breath through your nose and blow out through your mouth. And this is anytime you are going through that cool down cycle or bringing your heart rate back down to normal after you have done a burst training. Okay. Hopefully that principle will help you this week. Remember, your assignment this week is to add 2 to 5 seconds, if you possibly can, to each burst session that you are doing. And I look forward to talking to you next week about some other principles that we can use to increase our cardiovascular fitness.
Yes, thank you, Laura. All right, so we all can rest. We're going to go back into our second medical lecture with Dr. Inankur. Thank you. You can take it away.
Right, well, welcome back. As I mentioned in this section, we're going to talk about different fats in our diet, basically good fats and bad fats. And there will be 3 types: trans fats, saturated fats, and unsaturated fats. So not all fat is created equal, and these different types of fats have varying effects on our diabetes risk. The Nurses' Health Study conducted at Harvard University looked at over 80,000 nurses. They were studied for 16 years, and during that time period, over 3,000 new cases of diabetes were diagnosed. And these women were divided into 5 groups or quintiles, depending on how much saturated fat they consumed in their diet. The first quintile consumed the least saturated fat, and the 5th quintile of nurses consumed the most saturated fat. The researchers found that the risk of developing type 2 diabetes increased 40% in those who were consuming the most saturated fat compared to those who were consuming the least trans fats. So we're talking about trans fats here. I'm sorry if I said saturated fat. So trans fats are clearly harmful in their ability to increase our risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So where do we find trans fats in our diets? Well, small quantities are found in meat and dairy. Up to 10% of total fat in these foods is trans fats. Another source of trans fats historically has been hydrogenation, and this has been the main source of trans fats in US diet. Hydrogenation is a chemical process that food manufacturers use to turn liquids into solids, and the purpose is to create products that are spreadable and have long shelf lives. So trans fats have been used in things that would need long shelf lives, like baked goods that you would buy at a grocery store, pies, cakes. The FDA, however, banned trans fats in the middle of 2018. However, foods can still contain less than half a gram of trans fats per serving and be labeled as having 0 grams of trans fats. You can look for at sources of trans fats on the labels of packaged foods by looking for partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, which is a type of trans fat. Now, saturated fat is also a bad fat because, like trans fats, it increases our risk of type 2 diabetes. Saturated fat in the diet also raises our LDL cholesterol, and it raises it even more than cholesterol in the diet itself. So you would think that if we consume cholesterol in our diet, our cholesterol level would go up quite a bit from that. And it does go up when we consume cholesterol. Our dietary cholesterol raises our blood cholesterol levels. But saturated fat is even more of a powerful type of fat in raising our cholesterol levels in the blood. Saturated fat also increases LDL cholesterol, which is the bad cholesterol. A study at the US VA hospital system looked at 1,000 veterans and found that as LDL cholesterol concentrations rose, risk of heart disease and stroke rose very predictably. So where do we get saturated fatty acids? The National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, with data from the early 2000s among US adults, found that cheese was the #1 source of saturated fats. But there were other sources, including meats, other fats and oils, dairy products, processed meats were a major source. Also, the cakes, cookies, quick breads, pastry pies were a source. As I mentioned, the FDA has banned the use of trans fats in these processed items, but if you look at the packages of a lot of cakes and you look at the label, many of them will contain butter, which is high in saturated fat. Also, even salad dressings and mayonnaise were a source of saturated fatty acids. According to the American Heart Association, some vegetable oils are also predominantly composed of saturated fats. And these vegetable oils are palm oil, palm kernel oil, and coconut oil. So how long does it take for a meal that's high in fat and protein to raise blood sugars after a meal? Well, researchers looked at 24 individuals who had type 1 diabetes and were using insulin pumps. And they found that when these people ate a meal of pizza, which was high in fat and protein, and we know it was high in saturated fat because cheese is a source of saturated fat, when they ate that meal compared to a meal high in carbohydrates and low in fat and protein, blood sugars went up really 2 hours after a meal. They started to significantly climb, and they were higher for 4 to 6 hours after the pizza meals. So the advice that endocrinologists give patients on insulin pumps is to use a square wave bolus or dual wave bolus to spread out the insulin for the meal over a number of hours. That way, the insulin is available to cover these high blood sugars hours after a person eats a high fat meal. But we know that instead, a person could replace their high fat, high protein meal with a meal higher in carbohydrates. And you can see how a diet richer in carbohydrates would help a person to lower their blood sugars after meals and could help them to lower their blood sugars overall. Now, we've talked about the dangerous effects of trans fats and saturated fats, but there are actually some good fats as well. The same Nurses' Health study that looked at over 80,000 adult nurses looked at substituting 2% of their energy that these nurses were getting from trans fats or saturated fats with another energy source. So if they replaced only 2% of their calories that were coming from trans fats with unsaturated fatty acids, and in this case, polyunsaturated fatty acids, their risk of developing diabetes went down 39%. And if they replaced 2% of their energy that had been coming from saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, their risk of developing diabetes went down well over 10%. If they replaced the 2% of calories from trans fats with carbohydrate, so they didn't replace fat with fat, they ate carbohydrate instead, their risk of diabetes also went down over 20%. So polyunsaturated fatty acids are not as harmful when it comes to diabetes risk. Where do we get polyunsaturated fatty acids? Well, we can get them from nuts. A study looked at women who were consuming nuts, and they found that a handful of nuts a day helped to prevent obesity and type 2 diabetes in those women. Also, a study has shown that eating 4 servings of nuts per week lowered the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Now, a serving is 1 ounce or 28 grams, or as many nuts as fit into the palm of your hand. Now, it may seem counterintuitive that nuts can help prevent obesity because nuts are high in fat and fat is calorie dense. But nuts also have proteins, which increase our satiety after a meal. Nuts also contain fiber, which increase our satisfaction after a meal. And we're talking here about eating 1 serving or a palmful of nuts a day. Because nuts are high in calories, we don't need to eat a lot of them, but just 1 serving is enough to reap a lot of benefits. And where else can we get fat? Well, we can get unsaturated fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are beneficial for our diabetes risk. Those come in all foods. All whole foods are going to contain some fat, and you can see that even foods that taste sweet contain fat. So I really don't need to eat a lot of high-fat foods in order to get enough fat. And that is why the insulin resistance diet from Mastering Diabetes puts whole foods which are high in fat into the yellow light category. These are great sources of fats. The fats are very healthful, but we want to eat these fats in moderation because even excess of whole plant fats can increase our risk of diabetes. So green light foods, just to recap what we said last week, green light foods are foods that we can eat really without counting calories. We can eat them till we're satisfied. Yellow light foods we want to eat in moderation, kind of keep track of our servings. And then red light foods are the animal products and refined foods. We want to avoid those altogether. Last week, we talked about eating a healthy breakfast. And here's a strategy for building a good breakfast. We can start out with a whole grain, such as we get in a cooked cereal, or we could use a product made with a whole grain, such as waffles or pancakes. And we'll want to add fruit to our breakfast. We have lots of options there in beautiful colors. Legumes like beans, peas, or lentils are also very helpful to consume at breakfast. Legumes are high in fiber and they're high in protein, and they help to stabilize our blood sugars for hours. Nuts and seeds we can also add to our breakfast. This slide was from Dr. Linda Nelson. She is the mother of Dr. Eric Nelson. She has conducted many diabetes reversal seminars and has made plant-based eating simple. I hope all of you who were here last week have been able to use some nutrition logging software. I know I've been using Chronometer this week. This software will do the complicated math that would take us painstaking hours to accomplish. And the great thing is it's free. Remember, our targets are 70% carbs, 10 to 15% protein, and 15% fat. Now, it's not necessary to reach these targets exactly, but they are rough guides. And another thing to keep in mind is that fat intake can be adjusted for our physical activity level. So fat in our diet decreases our insulin sensitivity, but exercise increases our insulin sensitivity. So the exercise may counteract the change that we would have in insulin sensitivity from fat. So if you're more active, you can probably tolerate more fat. So in summary, a total fat in a meal raises blood sugars for 4 to 6 hours after that meal. And it's not just the quantity, but the quality of fat that matters. Sources of dangerous fats in the US diet are meat and dairy products. But there are great fats too, especially the unsaturated fatty acids, which we can find in all whole plant foods. I look forward to seeing you next Thursday for our discussion on protein, and may God bless you abundantly this week.